We've been talking about what happened at Grenfell so much over the last few years, and yet nothing seems to have actually changed. We still have huge numbers of people living in buildings which are just as dangerous as the Grenfell Tower. Many thousands stuck in homes which they can't afford to leave, can't afford to sell, can't sell, and living in fear for their lives. And yet very little action has actually been taken. What do you want the government to do?
Well, you're right, Julia. In fact, the problem's got worse over that time because there's now an ever-growing list of fire remediation works that need to be done to buildings that goes way beyond cladding or the ACM cladding as it began with 4 years ago. This now reaches into virtually all buildings, many buildings anyway, across the country. So the first thing we want to see the government do, and that's what we'll be doing as this bill passes through Parliament that's being published today, is we want the government to stick to its promise and legislate to ensure that leaseholders and homeowners will not be faced with the bills for putting these works right. Because you'll know, you've heard many stories over recent months of homeowners facing bills of tens of thousands of pounds to remediate their building, and it's not their fault, it's through no fault of their own. The second thing we want the government to do is to really get a grip of this issue. We're calling for a building works agency that would be a sort of crack team of experts that by building, from start to finish, would assess, fix, fund and crucially certify every building across the country so that then homeowners can finally move on, as you say, from this living nightmare of uninsurable, unmortgageable, unsafe homes that's taking a massive toll on their lives.
I mean, this is the extraordinary thing. These people that have done everything, they've done their due diligence, they've had their survey, they've been told everything's fine, the mortgage company said yes, fine, and then basically discovered they're living in a death trap. You can't sell it, you can't afford to do the works, and we just said, I mean, some of the bills people are getting, told at £50,000, £100,000. I mean, most people, even the most richest people, can't afford those sort of sums, and then still stuck, unable to get out of it. Now, the government, as part of this bill, their plan is to allow people extra time, extra years, 15 years after construction, to allow for people to take legal action over shoddy workmanship. That won't necessarily work for a lot of these buildings. They've been up for a lot longer, although a lot of the cladding itself has been done since then. But the UK Cladding Action Group has warned that companies may well have ceased to exist since completing buildings, and many of them will have chosen to cease to exist after the Grenfell fire. So that's not really going to make any difference at all, is it?
Not really, no. I mean, look, any extra redress is obviously to be welcomed, but the government really are looking at the wrong problem here. The issue is not, can a group of leaseholders come together and overcome the huge barriers to take legal action against the building developers, the barriers of cost, of time, of whether these developers and these companies are still in existence, because many of them simply fold and turn up elsewhere. That's not the issue. The government promised that in this bill, they would legislate to protect leaseholders from paying the bills, and they're not doing that. And we will be building a broad cross-party coalition where we nearly defeated the government on this before, to get that into legislation. And of course, you're right, there's no incentive here because the building owners are not necessarily the building developers. And while the building owners can pass on costs to leaseholders, it's not in their interest to pursue through the courts the developers. So it's the wrong problem.
Indeed. And I do think at the end of the day, just as the government ended up having to pay for, obviously, all the council-owned buildings to get them made safe, I think they're just going to have to bite the bullet on this one. And at the end of the day, it was a failure of regulation, was it not? The building. Basically, we're in a situation where I, with no qualifications whatsoever, would have been allowed under the regulations to sign off building cladding as safe. And that's the government. At the end of the day, that's a government's fault, not an individual, leaseholder's fault.
Well, yeah, I mean, look, actually, the government haven't paid for the council buildings. Actually, that's one of the real scandals of this. The social landlords have had to pay for that themselves. Yeah. So, I mean, they've had...
There's been a massive fund available, hundreds of millions of pounds. I mean, it doesn't probably go that far, but...
No, the council and social houses haven't been able to access that fund at all. So yes, there is. The government have set aside £5 billion, which is a huge amount of money, And the point I'm making is that with some real leadership and intervention, and with this building works agency that I'm describing, a task and finish group to really assess every building and then certify it at the end as safe, that 5 billion could actually have an impact.
Yep.
But at the moment, the costs are spiraling and spiraling. So not everything that is being identified as needing doing necessarily does need doing. All the risk has gone out of the system.